The old man ran his fingers across the rusted frame like he was touching something sacred. Nobody in the auction garage had paid attention to my Dodge 10 minutes earlier. To them, it was just another dead truck dragged in from some poor neighborhood outside Indianapolis. Faded paint, cracked bench seats, oil stains older than my daughter. Then the collector dropped to one knee beside the rear axle and wiped away 40 years of dirt with the sleeve of his coat. And suddenly, the room got quiet. I still remember the way he looked up at me after finding that factory stamp. Not excited, not greedy, almost emotional. Like he knew something about my father before I did. At that point, I hadn't slept right in months. My bills were stacked on the kitchen counter. My 12-year-old daughter barely spoke during dinner anymore. And 3 days earlier, I was seconds away from letting them crush that Dodge forever. If you're listening tonight, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always find it strange how people thousands of miles apart can somehow carry the same kind of memories. And if stories about family, second chances, and the things we almost throw away mean something to you, stick around until the end of this one. Because I nearly lost the last piece of my father over a misunderstanding. My name's Caleb Turner. I'm 42 years old, divorced, permanently tired, and raising a 12-year-old daughter named Lily in a small neighborhood just outside Indianapolis. Most mornings started the same way back then. Coffee too weak, bills too high, and that old Dodge sitting crooked in my driveway like a reminder of every unfinished thing in my life. It was a 1971 Dodge D100 pickup. Sun-faded blue paint, rust around the wheel wells, bench seat torn open at the seams. The engine hadn't properly run in almost 6 years unless I spent an hour begging it to wake up. The neighbors hated it. Honestly, some days I hated it too, but I could never get rid of it. That truck had belonged to my father, Ray Turner. He worked 31 years at the Chrysler plant before it shut down. He wasn't the kind of man who talked much. He fixed things instead. Radios, lawnmowers, broken cabinet doors. People brought him stuff because they trusted his hands more than repair shops. When I was little, I used to sit between him and the passenger door in that Dodge while he drove us to fishing spots before sunrise. He'd keep one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the gear shift like the truck was something alive he had to calm down. After he died, I inherited the Dodge along with a garage full of tools I barely knew how to use. For years I told myself I'd restore it. Then life happened. My divorce emptied most of my savings. Lily needed braces. The warehouse job cut overtime. And every year the truck sank deeper into the driveway while I got older and more embarrassed by it. By the time this story started, HOA warning letters were already showing up twice a month. Unregistered vehicle notice. Property violation. Final warning. I used to throw them into the kitchen drawer unopened. That Thursday afternoon, I came home carrying grocery bags and saw Lily sitting on the porch steps, staring toward the driveway. "You got another sticker," she said quietly. Sure enough, a bright orange violation notice was stuck to the Dodge windshield. Final 48 hours before tow enforcement. I closed my eyes for a second. Not because I was angry, because I was tired. Lily looked up at me carefully. "Dad, why don't we just let it go?" That question hurt more than I expected. Because deep down, part of me knew she wasn't talking about the truck. I set the grocery bags down beside the door and walked slowly toward the Dodge. My reflection stared back at me through the dusty driver's side window, older than I felt inside. The truck smelled the same when I opened the door. Oil, leather, cold metal, and faintly, the peppermint gum my father used to keep in the ashtray. I sat there for a minute with both hands on the steering wheel. Then I heard tires crunch against gravel behind me. A tow truck had just pulled into my driveway. The tow truck driver climbed out slowly, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Mid-50s maybe, heavy jacket, ball cap pulled low. Not rude, not friendly either. He glanced at the Dodge, then at me sitting inside it. "You, Caleb Turner." I nodded once. He sighed through his nose and checked something on a clipboard. "HOA filed the request this morning. I'm supposed to remove the vehicle unless you've got updated registration." I already knew I didn't. The registration had expired almost 4 years earlier. Every time I planned to deal with it, something else happened first. Rent increase, medical bill, school expense. Real life always seemed louder than old memories. Lily stood near the porch, hugging her sweater sleeves over her hands. The driver noticed her and lowered his voice a little. "Look, I don't like towing from family homes, but if I leave without it, they'll send county enforcement next." I leaned back against the cracked seat and stared through the windshield. Rain clouds were moving in. For a second, I could almost hear my father's voice again. "Easy, son. Don't make decisions angry." That was his thing. Anytime something broke, he slowed down instead of speeding up. Didn't matter if it was an engine or a marriage or a bad week, he believed rushing usually made damage worse. I wasn't built like him. I carried stress loud, sharp around the edges. My ex-wife used to say I walked around like somebody always owed me bad news. Maybe she wasn't wrong. The tow truck driver cleared his throat awkwardly. "You got somebody coming to help move it?" "No." "You planning to keep it?" That question sat between us longer than it should have. I looked around the inside of the truck. The old analog gauges, the faded steering wheel, tiny scratches in the dashboard from my father's wedding ring after decades of driving. I remembered being 10 years old, falling asleep against that passenger door while rain hit the roof above us during a fishing trip. I remembered my father covering me with his work jacket without waking me up. The truck wasn't really the problem. The problem was what happened if I let it go. Because once it disappeared, there'd be almost nothing left of him anymore. Dad Lily's voice came softly from outside. I looked over. She stepped closer to the open driver's side door. "You okay?" I forced a smile that probably looked worse than saying nothing. "Yeah, bug. I'm thinking." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. That kid noticed everything. The driver checked his watch. "Tell you what, I can give you till tomorrow morning before I file it complete. After that, my hands are tied." I looked up at him carefully. "Why?" He shrugged once. "Because you look like a guy trying real hard not to lose more than a truck." Then he handed me the paperwork and walked back toward his tow rig. I watched him leave while thunder rolled somewhere far off across the city. That night, Lily made boxed mac and cheese while I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by unopened bills and HOA notices. The orange violation sticker was sitting beside my coffee mug. Final 48 hours. Lily stirred her food quietly before finally asking, "Was Grandpa really that attached to the Dodge?" I stared toward the dark window over the sink. "Yeah," I said softly. "Why?" I thought about answering quickly. But the truth was, I wasn't completely sure anymore. And that scared me more than the towing deadline did. Because for the first time in years, I started wondering if my father had been hiding something inside that truck all along. I barely slept that night. Rain tapped against the kitchen window until almost 2 in the morning, and every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that orange sticker on the Dodge windshield. Final warning. Funny how a piece of paper can make a man feel like he's failing at life. By 6:30, I was already outside in work boots holding cold coffee and staring at the truck again. Water dripped off the hood in slow little trails. The faded blue paint looked almost gray in the morning light. Lily opened the front door behind me. "You going to work?" "Yeah." "You gonna decide about the truck today?" Straight to it. No small talk. I nodded slowly. "I have to." She looked relieved hearing me say it, which hurt a little more than I expected. Lily loved me. I knew that. But kids notice tension even when adults pretend they don't. That Dodge had become part of the stress in our house. Every warning letter, every awkward neighbor stare, every conversation about money somehow circled back to that truck sitting in the driveway. "I just don't want you upset all the time," she said quietly. I looked down at her. 12 years old, and already talking like someone older. That part wasn't my fault entirely. Her mom moving to Arizona 3 years earlier changed something in her. Lily stopped expecting people to stay. I reached over and fixed the hood of her sweatshirt. "I'll figure it out." She gave a small nod and headed toward the bus stop. The second she disappeared around the corner, a black SUV rolled slowly up beside my driveway. Martin Cole stepped out wearing a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Martin lived 3 houses down and headed the neighborhood HOA committee. Early 60s. Former commercial real estate guy. Always polite in that expensive kind of way that somehow felt worse than yelling. "Morning, Caleb." "Martin." His eyes drifted immediately toward the Dodge. I was hoping we could talk before things become official. They already seem pretty official. He smiled faintly like he'd expected that answer. "Look, I know the truck has sentimental value. I truly do. But several homeowners have complained." "Several?" "Yes." "Or just you?" That landed harder than I meant it to. Martin folded his hands calmly. "This neighborhood is changing. Families are investing serious money into these properties now. The association has standards for a reason." There it was. Not anger. Not cruelty. Just quiet pressure wrapped in polite language. I'd met men like Martin my whole life. Men who believed order automatically made them right. He glanced back toward the Dodge again. "You're a good father, Caleb. People see that. But perception matters, especially for Lily." That irritated me instantly. What's that supposed to mean? It means children absorb instability faster than adults realize. I laughed once under my breath, not because it was funny, because part of me hated that he might believe he was helping. Martin took a small envelope from inside his coat and handed it to me. Inside was another violation notice. Tow authorization scheduled for the next morning. "You still have today," he said carefully. "If the vehicle is voluntarily removed, additional penalties can be avoided." I stared at the paper while rainwater dripped from the Dodge bumper beside us. "You ever keep something too long because it reminded you who you used to be?" I asked quietly. Martin looked genuinely caught off guard by that. After a moment, he said, "Sometimes holding on becomes another way of hiding." Then he walked back toward his SUV without another word. I stood there alone in the driveway for a long time after he left. Angry at him. Angry at myself. Angry because somewhere deep down, I couldn't fully tell if he was wrong. By lunchtime at the warehouse, I'd already made my decision. After work, I was taking the Dodge to the scrapyard myself. Before someone else did it for me. The Dodge barely started that evening. I sat there turning the ignition over and over while the engine coughed like an old man trying to clear his lungs. For a second, I thought maybe the truck was finally making the decision for me. Then the engine caught. Rough, uneven, angry, but alive. Lily stood in the driveway holding her backpack against her chest while gray clouds stretched low across the sky. "You really taking it?" she asked. I nodded without looking at her directly. "Just to see what they'll offer?" That wasn't exactly a lie. But it wasn't the whole truth either. She climbed into the passenger seat quietly. The old springs groaned underneath her weight. For a minute, neither of us said anything. The windshield wipers dragged slowly across the glass with that tired rubber squeak I remembered from childhood. Same sound. Same truck. Different life. "You know," Lily said softly, "I barely remember Grandpa. I kept my eyes on the road. You were little. I remember his hands." That caught me off guard. I glanced over. "He always smelled like metal," she said, "and peppermint." I smiled before I could stop myself. "Yeah," I said quietly. "That sounds about right." The scrapyard sat on the edge of town behind a chain-link fence topped with bent wire. Mountains of crushed metal rose behind the office building like giant rusted tombstones. The second I pulled the Dodge inside, I felt something twist in my stomach. Like I'd betrayed somebody. A heavy-set guy in a stained flannel stepped out of the office, chewing sunflower seeds. "Need a quote?" "Maybe." He walked slowly around the Dodge, kicking one tire with his boot. Frame's rough, rust underneath, interior's shot. He shrugged. "Honestly, man, this thing's mostly weight at this point." I nodded, even though every word irritated me. "What's your offer?" He spat seeds into a cup. 800. Lily looked over at me immediately. $800. That was it. 31 years of my father's life. Fishing trips. Sunday repairs. Road trips. His old work gloves still stuffed under the seat. $800. The scrapyard owner must have seen something on my face because he softened his tone a little. "Look, don't take it personal. Old trucks come through every day." Not this one, I thought, but I couldn't explain why. Because honestly, I didn't fully know myself. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the driver's side door slowly. My fingers brushed against the faded paint near the handle. That was when I noticed Lily crouching near the passenger seat floorboard. "What are you doing?" "There's something stuck under here." She reached deeper beneath the old bench seat and pulled out a small black notebook covered in dust and grease stains. I frowned. Where'd that come from? No idea. The notebook looked familiar immediately. My father's handwriting covered the front. R.T. Just initials. Nothing else? I opened it carefully. Inside were pages of maintenance notes written over decades. Oil changes. Part numbers. Mileage logs. Tiny, messy handwriting squeezed into corners of the pages. Then near the back, one sentence caught my attention. Left rail stamp untouched. Keep clean. I stared at it. What does that mean? Lily asked. I don't know. Behind us, the scrapyard owner glanced over casually while wiping his hands with a rag. Then his expression changed. Hold on, he said. He walked closer and pointed at the notebook. Did you say factory stamp? Before I could answer, another voice spoke from somewhere behind the row of scrap cars. Mind if I take a look at that truck? I turned. An older man in a dark denim jacket was standing near the fence, watching the Dodge like he'd just seen a ghost. The older man walked toward us slowly, hands buried in the pockets of his denim jacket. Late 60s, maybe. Gray beard, work boots worn smooth at the heels. He didn't carry himself like somebody trying to impress anyone. But the second he looked at the Dodge, I could tell he saw something different than the rest of us. What year? He asked. 71, I said carefully. He nodded once without taking his eyes off the truck. D100. You know, Dodges? A faint smile crossed his face. Son. I've forgotten more about Mopars than most people ever learn. The scrapyard owner laughed under his breath. Walter collects old factory cars. Walter ignored him completely. Instead, he held his hand out toward me. Walter Briggs. Caleb? His handshake was firm but calm. Then he pointed toward the notebook still in my hand. Mind if I see that line again? I hesitated for a second before handing it over. Walter adjusted his glasses and read quietly. Left rail stamp untouched. Keep clean. The expression on his face changed almost immediately. Not excitement. Recognition. Who wrote this? My father? Worked at the Chrysler plant. Now it was my turn to stare. How'd you know that? Walter flipped another page in the notebook and pointed toward an old parts code scribbled near the margin. Internal assembly notation, he said. Plant workers used shortcuts like this all the time back then. For some reason, hearing that made my chest tighten. Like my father had suddenly stepped into the conversation from 20 years away. Walter walked slowly around the Dodge, studying details I'd stopped noticing years ago. The mirrors, the trim, the hood alignment, even the wheels. Meanwhile, the scrapyard owner leaned against the office doorway looking bored again. You telling me this rust bucket's special? Walter didn't answer immediately. That silence made the whole yard feel different somehow. Finally, he crouched beside the truck near the rear axle. Caleb, he said quietly. Did your father ever mention factory pilot vehicles? No. Special test units. Pre-production builds. I shook my head. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flashlight. Most people think rare cars are always flashy, he muttered while aiming light underneath the truck. But sometimes the important ones are the workhorses nobody paid attention to. Lily stepped closer beside me. What's he looking for? She whispered. I honestly don't know. Walter wiped dirt carefully away from part of the frame rail using an old cloth from his pocket. The scrapyard owner sighed dramatically. You're really crawling around under there for this thing. Walter still didn't answer him. Then, suddenly, he stopped moving. Completely. I watched his shoulders stiffen beneath the denim jacket. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Even the scrapyard noise in the distance seemed quieter. Then Walter slowly backed himself out from under the truck and stood up. His eyes locked directly onto mine. Where did your father get this Dodge? It was always his, I said, at least as far back as I remember. Walter looked back toward the truck again like he was trying to confirm something in his own head. You were about 5 minutes away from crushing a piece of factory history. The scrapyard owner laughed once. Come on. I'm serious. That changed the air instantly. I felt Lily move closer beside me. Walter turned back toward the Dodge and rested one hand lightly against the faded driver's side door. There's a factory stamp under that rail, he said quietly. And if I'm right about what it says, this truck was never supposed to leave Chrysler property. I stared at him. What does that mean? Walter exhaled slowly. It means your father may have spent 50 years hiding something incredibly rare in plain sight. Then he looked at me again. And I think he did it on purpose. I honestly thought Walter might be exaggerating. Not because he sounded dishonest, because nothing about my life lined up with words like rare or valuable. I drove a forklift 45 hours a week. My checking account sat under $300 most months. My daughter wore hand-me-down soccer cleats from a neighbor's kid. People like me didn't accidentally own historic vehicles. Walter must have noticed the skepticism on my face. "That look," he said with a small grin, "is the same one people gave me 30 years ago when I found a factory race Hemi sitting in a barn outside Toledo." The scrapyard owner crossed his arms. "You saying this thing's worth money?" Walter stood up slowly. "I'm saying we don't know yet." That answer irritated everybody except him. I liked that a little. Too many people rushed toward money the second they smelled it. Walter didn't. Instead, he asked questions. About my father. About the plant. About when the truck disappeared from regular use. The more I answered, the quieter he became. Finally, he looked toward me and Lily. "Would you mind if I cleaned the stamp properly?" I hesitated. Not because I thought he'd damage anything. Because suddenly the Dodge didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like opening a locked room in my father's life. Still, I nodded. Walter borrowed a small jack from the scrapyard office and slid himself halfway under the truck again. Lily stood beside me, hugging her sleeves nervously while the evening wind rattled loose metal somewhere across the yard. "How long was Grandpa keeping this thing?" she asked quietly. "Most of my life." "Did he know it was special?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. Because, for the first time, I wasn't sure. Walter spent nearly 10 minutes under there cleaning carefully around the frame rail. No rushing. No excitement. Just patience. My father used to work exactly like that. Little detail at a time. I suddenly remembered being 14 years old in our garage while Dad rebuilt a carburetor at midnight before work the next morning. I'd asked why he cared so much about old parts nobody would ever see. Without looking up, he told me, "The stuff nobody sees is usually what matters most." At the time, I thought he was talking about engines. Standing in that scrapyard years later, I realized maybe he wasn't. Walter finally slid back out, holding a flashlight under one arm. "Well," the scrapyard owner asked. Walter ignored him again and walked directly toward me. "You got your father's eyes," he said unexpectedly. That threw me off balance for a second. "What?" He looked tired in the same way. Something tightened in my chest hearing that from a stranger. Walter handed me the flashlight. "Look underneath yourself." I crouched slowly beside the truck. The metal frame rail was cleaner now, revealing stamped characters beneath decades of grime. Numbers. Letters. And one marking circled faintly in yellow paint. PD71X. I frowned. What does that mean? Walter's voice stayed calm. "Pilot Division." I looked back at him blankly. "Pre-production testing unit," he explained. Sometimes manufacturers built small internal batches before official release. Most were destroyed after evaluation. Lily blinked. "Destroyed." Walter nodded once. "They weren't supposed to survive." A strange cold feeling moved through me. I stared back at the Dodge, at the faded paint, at the cracked mirrors, at the steering wheel my father's hands held for 30 years. Suddenly the truck looked different. Not prettier. Not magical. Just heavier somehow. Like it had been carrying a secret longer than I'd been alive. The scrapyard owner stepped closer now, suddenly far more interested than before. "So, what's it worth?" Walter glanced at him sharply. "Not everything important gets measured that fast." I noticed something then. Walter wasn't excited about money either. He looked emotional, almost protective. Then he turned toward me again. "Caleb, there's a collector meet in Indianapolis this weekend. Private event, mostly factory historians and Mopar people." I already knew where this conversation was going. "No," I said immediately. Walter tilted his head slightly. "You haven't even heard the offer. I don't want this turning into some circus." "It already is." the scrapyard owner muttered. Walter ignored him. Then he looked directly at me and said something that stayed with me long after that night. Your father kept this truck alive for a reason, he said quietly. Don't crush the answer before you understand the question. I didn't agree to the collector meet right away. Actually, I spent most of that night trying to convince myself Walter was wrong. The Dodge was old, rare maybe, interesting to car people. Fine. But part of me resisted the idea that my father had secretly been protecting something valuable all those years without ever telling me. Because if that were true, then maybe I hadn't understood him nearly as well as I thought. Lily sat cross-legged on the living room floor while I spread the notebook across the coffee table. The pages smelled faintly like motor oil and old paper. You think Grandpa was hiding it on purpose? She asked. I don't know. You keep saying that. I looked over at her. Kids have a way of cornering adults without even trying. I think, I said slowly, your grandpa was the kind of man who carried things quietly. She nodded like that answer somehow made sense to her. Then she pointed toward one of the notebook pages. What's that number? I leaned closer. Another parts notation, another assembly code. And underneath it, a phone number. Old area code, faded ink, no name attached. I stared at it for several seconds before finally grabbing my phone. You gonna call? Might as well. The line rang 3 times before an older woman answered. Her voice sounded cautious at first. Hello. Sorry to bother you, I said. My name's Caleb Turner. I found this number in my father's notebook. Ray Turner. Silence. Long enough that I thought the call dropped. Then the woman exhaled softly. Lord, she whispered. Ray passed. Didn't he? About 11 years ago. Another silence. He still had the truck. That immediately made my stomach tighten. Yes. The woman gave a faint, sad laugh. Of course he did. I exchanged a look with Lily. Ma'am, who is this? My name's Diane Mercer. I worked quality control at the plant with your father. Now my pulse really picked up. Diane spoke slowly after that. Careful. Like she was sorting through old memories while she talked. She explained that near the end of the plant's early 70s production cycle, Chrysler experimented with several modified D100 units for durability testing. Most were stripped apart afterward. Except one. The blue truck, she said quietly. You knew about it. Everybody on Ray's shift knew. I sat back slowly in my chair. According to Diane, my father had spent months helping repair defects on the pilot truck after repeated testing failures. Other workers joked that he cared more about that Dodge than management did. Then the layoffs started. Then the restructuring. Then the plant changed. Ray believed they were going to destroy everything tied to that program, Diane said. He hated that. I rubbed my forehead slowly. So he stole it. Diane surprised me by laughing. No, your father wasn't a thief. Then how'd he end up with it? He bought it legally during surplus liquidation years later. Barely cost him anything because nobody understood what it was anymore. That hit me harder than expected. All those years. My father wasn't hanging on to junk. He was protecting a forgotten piece of his own life. Diane's voice softened before she spoke again. Ray used to say factories don't just build vehicles. They build people too. I looked toward the driveway through the living room window. The Dodge sat under the porch light, quiet and weathered. Still there. Still waiting. You should bring it to people who understand what they're looking at, Diane said gently. Your father would have wanted that eventually. After the call ended, Lily stayed quiet for a while. Then she asked the question I'd been avoiding myself. So, are we keeping it? I didn't answer immediately, because suddenly the truck wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged partly to my father, partly to history, and somehow, partly to Lily too. Then my phone buzzed on the coffee table. Huss. A text from Walter. Collector event starts Saturday morning. You in? I stared at the message while the house stayed completely silent around us. And for the first time since my father died, I honestly didn't know what the right thing to do was. Saturday morning came cold and clear. The kind of Indiana morning where the air smells like wet pavement and old leaves even in spring. I almost backed out 3 different times before Walter arrived. The Dodge looked cleaner than usual after Lily and I spent Friday evening washing years of dirt off the body panels. It still wasn't pretty. Rust remained around the wheel wells. The paint still looked tired. But underneath all that, I could finally see traces of the truck my father once loved. Walter pulled into the driveway in an old dark green Ram pickup and climbed out carrying 2 coffees. 1 cream, 2 sugars, he said, handing me a cup. I stared at him. How'd you know? Your father drank it the same way. That stopped me cold. Walter noticed my expression and shrugged lightly. We crossed paths a few times back in the day, mostly at plant events. You knew him. Knew of him? He corrected gently. Everybody respected Ray Turner. Something about hearing that from another man hit differently than hearing it from family. Lily climbed into the Dodge passenger seat while Walter followed us in his truck toward Indianapolis. The collector event was held inside an old industrial building converted into a private automotive gallery. Brick walls, polished concrete floors, vintage signs everywhere. The second I drove the Dodge inside, heads started turning. Not because the truck looked expensive, because it didn't. Everything else in the room gleamed under showroom lights, restored Chargers, perfect road runners, 6-figure muscle cars polished like jewelry. Then there was my father's faded work truck rattling into the middle of it all. I suddenly felt underdressed just standing there. A few people barely glanced at us before looking away again. Others didn't. An older man wearing a leather jacket walked slowly around the Dodge before quietly saying, "No way." Another guy crouched near the rear rail almost immediately. Within minutes, 3 different people were examining the truck underneath with flashlights. It felt surreal. Lily leaned toward me nervously. "Dad, why are they acting like that?" "Honestly," I whispered back, "I have no clue." Walter spoke quietly with several collectors nearby while I stood awkwardly beside the truck holding burnt coffee I'd forgotten to drink. That was when I noticed Martin Cole walking through the gallery entrance. Of all people. Perfect coat, expensive shoes, calm expression. For a second, I genuinely thought I might leave. Martin spotted me almost immediately and approached with his usual measured confidence. "Caleb?" he said. Quite the turnout. "What are you doing here?" He glanced around casually. "I serve on the board for a local preservation foundation. Walter contacted someone we work with." Of course he did. Part of me instantly assumed Martin was about to somehow attach himself to this whole thing publicly. And honestly, maybe that was unfair. But after months of warning letters and pressure, I couldn't help it. Martin looked toward the Dodge. "I had no idea your truck was historically significant." "Neither did I." He nodded once. "For what it's worth, I'm glad it wasn't destroyed." I studied his face carefully. No sarcasm. No hidden jab. Just honesty. That unsettled me more than if he'd insulted me. Before I could answer, A woman's voice interrupted from behind us. Who owns the blue D100? A small crowd had started gathering near the truck now. Walter motioned for me to come over. I walked toward them slowly, while Lily stayed close beside me. One of the collectors pointed underneath the frame rail with visible excitement. Another man shook his head repeatedly like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then an older woman stepped forward through the group. The second her eyes landed on the Dodge, her entire expression changed. Not excitement. Recognition. Real recognition. She looked at me carefully. Then she asked softly, "You're Ray Turner's son, aren't you?" The room suddenly felt smaller around me. I looked at the older woman standing beside the Dodge and nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said, "I'm Caleb." Her eyes softened immediately. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "You look just like him around the eyes." People say things like that all the time after funerals. Usually it feels polite more than meaningful. But coming from her, it landed differently. She stepped closer to the truck and rested her fingertips lightly against the hood like she'd done it before, decades ago. "My name's Helen Brooks," she said. "Your father and I worked final inspection together in '72. Walter gave me a small look from across the truck, like this moment mattered. And somehow, it did. Helen walked slowly around the Dodge while the collectors nearby stayed unusually quiet. "He kept it alive," she murmured almost to herself. "I can't believe he actually kept it alive." I frowned. People keep saying things like that. What exactly was so important about this truck? Helen looked at me for a long second before answering. "Because this wasn't just a pilot truck." The room stayed completely silent. She glanced toward the rear rail underneath the truck. That unit was part of a durability redesign program after several failures in earlier production models. Most management wanted the project buried because it cost too much money. Walter nodded quietly beside her. Helen continued. "Your father fought with supervisors constantly about it. Said the workers were getting blamed for engineering mistakes they didn't create." That sounded exactly like him. Ray Turner hated unfairness more than almost anything. Didn't matter if it was overtime pay or Little League umpires or grocery stores shorting cashiers $2. If he thought something was wrong, he dug his heels in hard. Usually too hard. I inherited that from him, unfortunately. He believed that truck represented the best work ordinary people at the plant ever did. Helen said softly, "Not management. Not executives. The workers." I swallowed slowly. For years, I thought Dad kept the Dodge because he couldn't let go of the past. But standing there, listening to her, I realized maybe he wasn't holding on to the past at all. Maybe he was protecting proof that his life meant something. Helen smiled faintly while looking through the driver's side window. "He used to eat lunch inside this truck during overtime shifts," she said. "Always peppermint gum in the ashtray." Lily looked up at me instantly. I felt my throat tighten. That tiny detail somehow hit harder than the factory stamp. Because it made him real again. Not just my memory of him. Other people remembered him too. Walter folded his arms carefully. "Most likely surviving unit from that program," he said to the group nearby. "Especially with documentation." One collector immediately stepped forward. "I'd like to discuss a purchase offer." Then another voice joined in. So would the museum. Suddenly everybody wanted something. Offers. Meetings. Phone numbers. One man even started talking auction estimates that sounded completely unreal to me. I felt myself shutting down almost immediately. The Dodge stopped feeling like my father again. It started feeling like prey. Lily noticed before anyone else did. She tugged lightly on my jacket sleeve. "Dad." I looked down. You okay? I wasn't. Not really. Because everybody around me seemed excited about the truck's value, while all I could think about was my father sitting alone inside it during lunch breaks 40 years ago. Helen seemed to notice the shift in my face, too. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. Your father never cared much about money, Caleb. I laughed softly under my breath. Yeah, I know. He cared about dignity, smite. That word stayed with me. Dignity. Not pride. Not stubbornness. Something deeper. Helen reached into her purse and carefully pulled out an old photograph folded at the edges. She handed it to me. 3 factory workers stood beside the Dodge outside the Chrysler plant. One of them was my father, younger than I'd ever seen him. Smiling. Actually smiling? On the back of the photo, written in faded blue ink, were 6 simple words. Built by hands people forgot mattered. I stared at those words for a long time. Then Lily quietly slipped her hand into mine. And in that moment, I realized I didn't want strangers deciding what happened to my father's truck anymore. By the end of the afternoon, I stopped answering questions about selling the Dodge. At first, people assumed I was negotiating. Bidding strategy. Auction pressure. Typical collector stuff. But that wasn't it. The truth was simpler. For the first time since my father died, the truck no longer felt like a burden I'd failed to get rid of. It felt like a conversation I finally understood. Walter found me standing alone near the back wall of the gallery while Lily looked through old factory photos with Helen. You look overwhelmed, he said. I am. He nodded like he expected that answer. Then he handed me a folded brochure from the Indianapolis Automotive Heritage Museum. They're serious, he said quietly. Climate-controlled exhibit. Worker history section. They'd preserve the truck properly. I looked down at the brochure. A week earlier, I almost sold the Dodge for scrap metal. Now museums were asking for meetings. Life's strange sometimes. I don't want it turned into some rich guy trophy, I admitted. Walter leaned beside me against the brick wall. Then don't let that happen. Simple answer. Dad used to talk like that too. I glanced across the room toward the Dodge. Several people still circled around it carefully, but the energy had changed now. Less greed. More respect. Even Martin stayed unusually quiet. After a while, he walked over holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Peace offering, he said awkwardly. I accepted one, mostly because refusing felt childish. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Martin sighed. I owe you an apology. That surprised me enough to actually look at him. I pushed too hard. You thought you were right. I did. He stared across the room toward the Dodge. But I forgot something. What's that? Communities aren't built only from clean lawns and property values. Coming from anybody else, the line might have sounded rehearsed. But Martin looked genuinely uncomfortable saying it, which somehow made it more believable. I took a slow sip of coffee. You know, I said, part of me almost hates that the truck turned out valuable. Martin frowned slightly. Why? Because people finally respected it after they heard a number attached. He thought about that carefully before answering. Maybe, he said slowly, but some people respected it because they finally understood the story. That one stayed with me. A few hours later, after the crowd thinned out, Lily and I sat alone inside the Dodge for the first time that day. The old truck smelled warmer now from sunlight hitting the cracked bench seats. Lily traced one finger along the dashboard scratches near the steering wheel. Grandpa's ring marks, she asked. Yeah. She smiled faintly. Then after a quiet minute, she looked at me. You don't seem sad anymore." That hit harder than anything else all weekend, because she was right. For years after Dad died, every time I looked at the Dodge, I felt guilt. Guilt for not fixing it. Guilt for being broke. Guilt for becoming the kind of man who leaves things unfinished. But somewhere along the way, the truck stopped representing failure. It started representing survival. My father survived layoffs, long shifts, a changing world that forgot men like him mattered. And somehow, through all of it, he left behind proof that ordinary people build pieces of history too. A month later, I signed an agreement with the museum. Not a sale. A long-term preservation partnership. The Dodge would stay displayed with my father's name, his factory photo, and the story of the workers who helped build it. And every few weeks, Lily and I still visited. Sometimes we'd sit quietly beside the truck for a while before heading home. One afternoon, Lily rested her head against my shoulder and smiled up at me. "You know what Grandpa was really saving?" "What?" She squeezed my hand gently. "Us." And honestly, I think she was right. Sometimes the things people call junk are carrying entire lifetimes inside them. Not because they're worth money, but because they hold memories, sacrifice, dignity, and pieces of people we're afraid to lose. If this story meant something to you, I'd genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever kept something old because it reminded you of someone you loved? Maybe a truck, a jacket, a watch, a recipe card, anything that still carries a heartbeat long after someone's gone. And tell me where you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If you stayed with Caleb and Lily all the way to the end, thank you. Seriously. Stories like this remind us that ordinary people matter more than the world sometimes admits. Fathers, factory workers, single parents, quiet people carrying heavy things without complaining. So, if you enjoy emotional storytelling like this, feel free to like the video, subscribe, and follow the channel for more stories about real people, hard seasons, second chances, and the small things that end up meaning everything. Take care of yourselves tonight. And maybe hold on to the good memories a little tighter. One of the hardest lessons life teaches us is that people rarely understand the weight another person is carrying. Sometimes the quiet man driving an old truck is holding on to the last memory of his father. Sometimes a tired single mother working double shifts is fighting battles nobody sees. And sometimes the things the world calls worthless are the very things keeping someone emotionally alive. As we get older, we start realizing that life is not really about status, money, or appearing successful to strangers. It's about the people who stayed. The sacrifices nobody applauded. The small moments that quietly shaped who we became. A coffee shared before sunrise. A worn-out tool passed from one generation to another. A voice you still remember years after it's gone. Never be too quick to judge someone's story from the outside. Because behind almost every scar, every old object, every tired pair of eyes, there's usually love hidden somewhere underneath. If this story touched your heart, even a little, I'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me about something meaningful you've kept over the years and why it still matters to you today. And if you enjoy emotional storytelling about real life, family, struggle, healing, and second chances, make sure you subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories that remind us what really matters in life.